everybody, this is Meredith from the Witty Gritty Paper Co, and today we are going to be talking all about Watermedia. And basically, Watermedia is just anything that is water soluble, but it's not technically paint. So the most common ones would be like watercolor pencils, watercolor markers, watercolor crayons, all that fun stuff. And there's been a lot of these kinds of products coming on the market lately, so I thought I would just sort of clear up their uses and what I think they're best for, particularly for beginners. So we're going to start with watercolor pencils. To me, there are basically three different main categories of water media: watercolor pencils, watercolor markers, and watercolor crayons. But there are also sort of off-the-wall ones like watercolor chalk, I think there is, and watercolor pastels, and there's a lot of this kind of stuff being released right now. But I'm just going to focus on the main categories for our video today. So what I have here are 12 Derwent brand watercolor pencils, and I really like the Derwent ones, although I haven't tried too many brands because I've been happy with these. So I think they're a solid recommendation. And as you can see, they look pretty much like any normal colored pencil. And they go on dry and they activate with water, which is the meaning of water media. So I think that I would just like to clear up, first of all, that I don't think that water media is paint. I did a paint video a while back and I had a couple people say, you forgot watercolor pencils or you forgot watercolor markers or whatever. And that's just because I don't really consider them paint. And that's not to say that they aren't great art materials. It's just, to me, they're not paint. They're water media. They're extras. So I'll dive right into what I think these are best for here. Okay, so what I think watercolor pencils are best for is honestly sketching. To me, they are a dry media. They're not a wet media. I like to use them as though they are a dry media. And I've got just a little portrait here I did earlier. And the whole thing is in watercolor pencil. As you can see, I only used one color. And the reason they're so great for drawings and for sketches is because you have a water-soluble sketch. So if you go to add paint to it, it's going to dissolve. Your sketch is going to dissolve. You're not going to have any of that where you do a good pencil drawing and then you paint over it, but you realize your lines were too dark, because you can't erase. Once you paint over normal, regular pencil-lead sketches with watercolor, you can't erase them. So that's a problem for a lot of people. So that's not going to happen with your watercolor pencils. You're going to be able to just dissolve it right up. And another thing I like about them for sketching is that if you're using more inexpensive student grade paper and you find yourself sketching, then this is with normal pencil lead, sketching with normal pencil lead and then erasing a lot and sketching a lot and erasing a lot. What can happen sometimes with the inexpensive papers is the paper can pill. First of all, you get little paper pilling. Or you can create this sort of weird slick surface from erasing too much and it won't accept paint. So sometimes that happens with the less expensive papers. So that's another advantage to watercolor pencils, is that if you make a mistake, like look, there's this tiny little thing here. If you make a mistake, you can just get it wet. And let me just grab a paper towel here. You can just get it wet and dab it right off. Goodbye mistake. So they've got a lot of great uses. I don't recommend them as a main painting media though. If you want to get into paint, get into watercolor painting, then buy watercolor paints. So let's just do a little bit of liquefying here. I'm going to do her hair just because I think it would be nice to add a little bit of softness to the sketch because the hair would be softer. And so you just get a nice sort of sketch and painting in one. That's what I like the best about the watercolor pencils. See, that looks lovely. Okay, next up on our Water Media 101 is watercolor markers. Now, what I have here are three different types of watercolor markers. Let me just move that out of the way. I have got these guys, which are Winsor & Newton, these ones, and these ones. Now, these ones are actually real watercolor artist markers. And what I mean by that is that they're made with real watercolor pigments, they've got light fast ratings, and they're made in colors that you would normally see on professional grade watercolor paint. So they don't have weird names like Blossomberry. Like, they're not made up names. They're actually traditional paint names, like, let's see, burnt red, lemon yellow hue, mid blue. So you can buy them in the more traditional paint colors. And then these ones over here are different. They are water-based markers. And the difference is that, you know, they're probably made with dyes. They don't have light fast ratings. And basically they're not artist grade. You wouldn't want to make original art to sell if you were using these, just because they might fade and all sorts. They're not meant to last forever, but these ones are artist grade. And I believe these ones are Winsor and Newton, but I believe they're the only company that makes artist grade ones. There might be others, but this is the only one I've heard of. And some other differences are these are more expensive. These artist grade ones are about $8 a pop. You can probably get them cheaper online, you know, coupon codes, half off deals, all that fun stuff. But as a general rule, they're always going to be more expensive than these water-based markers, which are more like $2 to $5 a pop, depending on how you buy them. I got mine a little cheaper because I bought them in bigger packs, but you know, it all depends on where you get them. And these ones are Spectrum Aqua brand, and these ones are Tombow brand. So once again, both of these are water-based, and these ones are technically these ones are the only ones that are watercolor markers that actually have watercolor pigment in them. So what I love markers for is, first of all, I'll confess that they're actually my favorite of all the Watermedias. I just think they're really easy. And part of the reason I think they're so easy is you can just, let me grab this here. You can just take a plate so you don't feel like getting all your paint out. You just take a plate and you can scribble it out. Just grab a wet brush here. Just activate it and you got paint. You've got like instant paint with watercolor markers. And that doesn't really work with watercolor pencils so much. I've tried it. Doesn't really work so well, but you've got like instant paint with the watercolor markers. So that's really convenient. And I also like them for hand lettering. And the reason is most of them have brush tips. So these ones, the Spectrum Aquas, have brush tips and they have fine point tips. The Tombows, I think, are the same. And these ones, the Winsor Newton, have a brush tip and a bullet tip. That's a bullet tip. And a brush tip. And the other nice thing about watercolor markers is that they mix really well together. So let's just clean that up. If I wanted to mix together some of that with a darker blue, just scribble them out, and they're going to mix really well together. Ooh, what a pretty color. It's like cool periwinkle. Very pretty. So that's another advantage. They're like instant paint. I love them for that. And we can do a little hand lettering here too. Why don't we try that? Here I'm just demoing a little bit of hand lettering with one of the Winsor Newton artist markers. And these ones actually have super great tips on them. They're really, they stay really sharp. The Spectrum Aquas here, their tips tend to fray a little bit more. I'm not really sure why. You probably can't see that, but they tend to fray a little bit more. But I still love them. I still use them all the time. So if that's important to you, if that's a pet peeve of yours, these Winsor Newton ones are really good for that. They have good tips on them. So I'll just finish this quick and I'll show you what I love about it. The great thing about all the Watermedia that I'm showing you here today is that you can get two looks from it. With watercolor paint, you're going to get the look of watercolor paint. But with any Watermedia, you can get two different looks. You can get, like what we're doing right here, you can get the marker look. Or if you take a wet brush, you can get the watercolor look. You know, just by getting it wet a little bit, I turn my lettering into watercolor lettering. And I could be a little bit neater about this, but I just want to prove the point here. No, it immediately has a whole other dimension to it just because it can do that. Instead of trying to do this with paint, which is harder, I can tell you from personal experience, you could do it with a marker and then just get it wet. So that's what I like watercolor markers for. I feel like they are great for any sort of rubber stampers as well, or anybody that just sort of wants to dabble in watercolor but doesn't really want to dive right in and get a whole set of paints. Okay, and the third Watermedia category that I want to talk about today is watercolor crayons. Now I have here some Caran brand Neocolor watercolor crayons, and I also have some Faber Castel brand watercolor gelatos. So the crayons are, you know, the more direct thing I'm talking about, and the gelatos are just one of those spin-offs that I mentioned. There are a lot of these sort of extra products on the market. So these are actually pretty unique. The Caran ones are a really good brand. I would say that I notice more in watercolor crayons than in markers or pencils. I notice when the quality is worse because, you know, this is a waxy product, and waxy and watercolor don't really go together naturally, I guess is what I'm saying. So getting a good watercolor crayon is difficult. Like the formula, I'm sure, is difficult to manufacture. So you don't want to buy a cheap watercolor crayon. If you're going to get into watercolor and watercolor media, and you don't want to spend the money on the Caran because they are a little pricey, grab something like a gelato, because these are really similar. They're really similar. You can do almost the exact same thing. They're almost the exact same texture, and they're very similar. And they were a lot less expensive. So as far as brands go, that's what I would say, is you don't have to spring for the crayons if you can't get a good enough brand, because you'll be sad if you get cheap watercolor crayons. They will not work well and you will be sad. So my favorite uses for these actually lie outside traditional watercolor paintings. I prefer to use these for like card making and stamping and mixed media. They're invaluable for mixed media. They rock because you can put on a sort of oilier look and then you can liquefy it if you decide you don't like it. That's one really rare thing. Getting the look of an oil pastel or an oil paint in watercolor is really difficult. And this is the only way that I know to do it, that you could start like this. And if you want, you could just wet the edge of it. I mean, that's really cool. It looks like oil pastel turned into watercolor. Like, that's really hard to get any other way. So that's one really cool thing about them, is you can get a very oil pastel, oil paint look without any actual oil products, because we all know that oil and water do not mix. So that's their main pros. Another thing you may not be able to tell from far away about the watercolor crayons / gelatos is they are awesome for texture. So what I've got here is some sort of cheaper student grade watercolor paper. So it doesn't have a ton of tooth. It's made from wood pulp, not cotton. So it's just not the most textured thing in the world. But if I just go over it gently with a watercolor crayon, you can see it only touches the tooth of the paper. So you get some really great texture. The only way you can get this with traditional watercolor paints is to use a very dry brush, which is a tiny bit of pigment, and just like work super dry and drag it across the tooth. That works with watercolor paint, but it's so much easier with this. Like, it wants to only stay on the top of the paper. You can see it a lot with the gelato. I actually might prefer the gelatos because I like their broad circular sort of tip rather than the crayons. And also the crayons make me nervous because I'm notorious for like dropping my crayons and having them break into a million pieces. So that makes me a little nervous to use them. But the crayons actually are also good for what the pencils were good for. You can do little sketches and liquefy them. So if you say you didn't like working in pencil, you could do the crayons instead. That would work. Or say you only had crayons, that would work. So you just do a portrait. That's like a terrible, terrible example, but you guys, you know what I mean. If you just do a super quick little portrait and liquefy the crayon, you have like skin tone color. So I prefer to do this with the pencils, but again, you can do it with the crayons. I wouldn't really recommend it with the markers. The markers aren't going to blend as well. But with the crayons or the pencils, I think the sketching and then liquefying is a solid choice. And like the markers, you can actually take these and you can scribble them out. Now, this is a super light color, so this might not liquefy well, but we'll see. We can try a darker one if it doesn't. Yeah, so it liquefied. Let's see if we can see it. Yeah, it's super faint. This is a really light blue, so it's probably not my best choice. Let's try a darker one, because they work good for this, just like the markers do. You scribble it out. We'll scribble out some more next to it. We'll mix them together. the pencils don't mix together as well as like the markers and the crayons will mix together. Let me make sure this is in frame. The markers and the crayons will mix together when you liquefy them. So they mix together perfect. It's not separating, it's not fighting. I think that's so cool. Like, it's such a waxy feeling thing, but then it liquefies just like watercolor. It's super cool. It doesn't resist water. So both the crayons and the markers will work if you want to use them, scribble them out and mix them together and use them like paint. They'll work for that. I just wouldn't recommend that for the pencils. And actually, let me zoom out here, because one last thing you can do, which my students in the past have found like super helpful, is let me zoom out so we're on the same page here. Okay. One last thing you can do is you can actually take a wet brush, and you can do this with 2 out of 3 of the Watermedia that we talked about here today. You can take a wet brush here, and here's a watercolor pencil, and you can dab it on the tip, okay? And you might have to do this a little bit to work to get the color to release, but there you go. Didn't have to work very hard. This is a high quality pencil, so it releases pretty easy. Now, I've heard some people say that you shouldn't do this to your pencils because it like rots the wood or something. Personally, I've done it ever since I started using them, which is a couple years, and I've never had a problem. They don't get weird. They still sharpen fine. So I guess do it at your own risk, but it's always worked for me, so I really wouldn't worry about it too much. And you can also do this with the crayons. However, I would strongly recommend that you don't do it with the markers, because what will happen is if you do it with the markers, that's such a pale color. If you do it with the markers, the water in your brush is going to sort of shoot up into the tip of the marker, because the marker, that's what the tip's designed for, is to hold liquid. So if you do that, it's going to like shoot up in there, and it's going to like fade your color. The marker's not going to work as well. Sometimes you can scribble it right out again, and it's okay, but I really wouldn't do that. The markers are already a wet media, so I don't see any reason why you'd want to do that either. Let's try this on a gelato, because that was disappointing. That was like barely anything. Yeah, wow, that's like, you can't even see that. Jeez. Okay, well, you guys get the idea. You can just take a wet brush on either pencils or crayons and gelatos, if yours are a little bit more willing to cooperate than mine are. There we go. There we go. I guess you just need a darker color. So I did that by just touching the wet brush to the crayon, and you can also do that with the pencil. And it basically just makes your supplies go a lot further. That's sort of my point in making this video, is sort of to illustrate how if you have these sort of extra water media things, they're great to, you can do a lot of things with them. They're not limiting. They're a little bit more versatile than just plain watercolor paints. So depending on what you already do or how experienced of a painter you already are, these might be better options for you to start out with, rather than just going ahead and buying a big watercolor set. And closing thoughts here, I would just like to say I've had a lot of requests for different videos in the past, all sorts of topics, and I read them all, but what happens is they're on all different videos on my channel, so they sort of get lost in the shuffle. So what I've done is I've created an official request page for everybody, and I will link to it in the description. And if you ever have a request for a video, then you can go to that page and you can post your request, or if somebody else has already requested it, you can like their comment or whatever. And the most popular things will probably be the things that get filmed first. So hopefully everybody thinks that's a good idea. I think it'll be good for me if I can keep all the requests in one place. I think it'll be more organized. So once again, link in the description for that. So thank you everybody for watching. If this video was a help to you, please like and subscribe if you want to see more videos like it. And thanks again for watching. I hope you all have a great day. Bye.